Our business correspondent, Paul Kelso, is back in the Daily Podcast studio. And on your favourite topic, of course, Brexit.
Yeah. Indeed, Brexit border controls. I hope everyone's sitting down.
Yeah, so walk us through this. Brexit, of course, the gift that keeps on giving. What are these new changes and when are they coming in?
Right, so we're nearly 8 years after the vote. Brexit's done, right? Well, actually, it's not for EU exporters who are sending stuff to the UK. So for British businesses importing stuff from the EU, Brexit hasn't even begun. And it starts Jan 31st, Wednesday of this week, where there will be the first of a staged series of customs checks and declarations required for what are termed medium risk plant and animal products, which in plain English means food and some cut flowers. So there are 5 types of cut flowers, very common ones, orchids, chrysanthemums, and the like, and a load of dairy produce, cheese, eggs, frozen and chilled meat and fish, all of which could carry some risk of disease in terms of food and biosecurity threat in terms of plants. They're worried about things called leaf mites, which can destroy the foliage. And these checks, which haven't existed for 4 decades, will now have to be made. The first checks, January the 31st, you will have to get a health certificate for your cut flowers or your food product. If you're a British importer, you will have to get the EU side of the deal has to get a local vet or plant inspector to provide a bespoke declaration that your herd of goats, which has produced your goat's cheese, is safe and free of disease, and for the plants that there's no nasties in there, and that has to be provided before the goods can be let into the UK. Then in 3 months' time, at the end of April, there will be physical checks on a quota of each of those products at the British border.
Okay, simply put, why? How have we managed to get away with not doing these things and not being ravaged by some bioplague being imported with a bunch of chrysanthemums?
Is a good question, and I've been in the Netherlands last week, where they are. I'll give you the example from the Netherlands. They would tell you, and they would say this, wouldn't it? It's adding cost to their processes, but they're unnecessary. They say plants that say they import some stuff from Ecuador, 100% of it's checked when it gets off a plane at Schiphol. And then it gets a health certificate to be sold within the EU anyway. They then check it in their factory. Now what they're doing is putting in the corner of the factory, so a separate inspector comes to do the British paperwork, another process. Could be that 6 hours later, when it comes out the other side of the tunnel, it'll get checked again. The reason, DEFRA, the Cabinet Office, what government say is that it is largely 2 elements. The main one is biosecurity. They need to have checks to protect the UK, which is an island and has got a natural defence around it, from stuff we don't want in our food chain or in our plant chain. They also say it will help level the playing field for British companies, and this has been the case. Remember, for anyone exporting from the UK to the EU, from day one, they faced all these barriers, so it will level the playing field.
But aren't we in a state of regulatory alignment? I mean, don't we have the same standards and controls as our brothers on the continent?
We do, and I've checked this repeatedly with everyone. There has been zero divergence in the jargon. There are no different regulations. We are exactly as we were. So these processes, it can feel bureaucratic. There is, when I've asked for where's the evidence of risk, you get quite hard pushback saying Britain needs to control its borders and these are worthwhile. And they stress they are trying to minimise the disruption.
Trying to minimise the disruption. I mean, look, 2 things occur to me. One, you add checks, you're adding costs, as you've already alluded to. Second, if you're adding checks, you're possibly adding delays. And we're talking about a supply chain here. We're talking about goods like flowers, fresh cut flowers, foodstuffs and all the rest of it. I mean, these are things that have a literal shelf life.
Absolutely, they do. I mean, to reflect that, the health declarations, the health passport for the cut flowers only lasts 48 hours because after that they're not usable. The risk of delay, there's cost. The cost is, how much does a vet inspection cost? Well, it costs £50 to £100 here, about €50 to €100 on the continent. That could be per consignment or per item within the consignment. I've spoken to a wholesaler at New Covent Garden Market who's got 28 different items that he thinks will need different kinds of flour. that one way or another will need checking.
Which will not be coming in 28 separate containers.
They come on one container.
Right.
He thinks so so if he adds the cost, there's a cost for the UK border. They haven't finalised it yet, up to 40 quid. He reckons he could be looking at £1,000 for customs checks on an invoice value of £7,000. He's talking nearly 20% on his costs coming in. The delay point is one that they're really worried about. If paperwork's wrong, technically it is not allowed to enter the UK. So there could be delays on the paperwork. When we get to April and 5% of chrysanthemums or 30% of soft cheese, I don't know the precise quotas, but that's how it's going to work. When they're pulled aside, the guidance is that's guaranteed 4 hours. Now, if your plants leave Holland at midnight, a bit earlier, to be on the other side of the tunnel and in London or at market elsewhere for 2 a.m. when the florists come in, and you've got bouquets for a wedding to sort and it's held up for 4 hours, that supply chain is interrupted.
And of course, all of these costs, presumably, are going to be passed on to the consumer. Costs, be it for those inspections that need to take place, costs for the insurance that presumably companies will be taking out on their loads, the cost of the loads that will be lost because at some point there will be delays. I mean, we're all going to be paying a lot more for stuff that comes from just the other side of the channel.
We are, and it's the point that's made, whichever end of this you look at. The UK Hendor, I mean, I happen to have spent some time in the Netherlands. They can't see any way where the cost doesn't end up with the final producer. And, I mean, there's another element to this we should probably tap into, which is I've sketched out as of January 31st, it's some foodstuffs and cut flowers. There's a whole range of really common fruit and vegetables that have also been classified with less than 10 days' notice, it should be said, as medium risk. Hard to believe this has been in consultation for 3 years.
Right.
Last week, unbeknownst and unannounced to the industry, a host of fruit and veg, peppers, quince, perhaps not as common, quite common around your way, I know.
Obviously, the trendy media types like
cucumbers,
myself,
the like, were added to the list without fanfare by DEFRA. The industry threw up its hands and they said they've been classified as medium risk, but for now, and this can get complicated, they'll be treated as if they're low risk, so none of the checks we've been talking about will apply.
So they're voluntarily waiving
They're voluntarily waiving
right.
those because they don't want disruption, because when we're talking 80% of our imported fruit and veg comes from Europe, 40% of the, it's about 60% of fruit and veg together comes from the EU. But they said at 3 months' notice, that could change. Even the Cabinet Office and DEFRA say this is going to have an impact on food inflation. 0.2% will be added to food inflation over the course of 3 years.
And that may well be an underestimate as well.
This is going to make shopping more expensive.
Why on earth would the government, in the shape of DEFRA, why would they not give industry the heads up? Why would they suddenly just decide, as you say, 10 days out to change the playing field? I understand that they're given 3 months notice and there's going to be a period where they'll just ignore the fact that they should be checking, because otherwise why would you introduce those checks in the first place? But I don't understand why they would do
And
this.
I have to say, nor do I. And I've asked, it was journalists elsewhere who first spotted this. We followed it up. In fact, the rules changed twice in 24 hours. And I've spoken to the Cabinet Office, to DEFRA. No minister has been made available. It's not really clear to me why it has happened. These rules have been delayed, we should remember, 5 times in 3 years. Now, there's been some big challenges to
Obviously.
the UK supply chains, COVID, the war in Ukraine. The cost of living has been a permanent worry. But they have had plenty of chances to get this right. And I think the issue is that industry has been walked up the hill so many times and then walked back down. I'm not sure many will actually believe this is going to happen till it actually happens. Government says, insists it is going to happen. We're very close to it. But certainly in Europe, people have been receiving, translated leaflets about how to handle stuff you're shipping to the UK, and then it's not happened. And you can imagine that many won't adjust to this on the morning. Should be said, on the first day, Cabinet Office saying they're going to be pragmatic. They're not going to be turning people back for minor lapses in paperwork. They're going to give this time to work. But it is finally a real-world impact at the border of Brexit.
Not for the first time on this podcast. I feel like I've been taking crazy pills. I mean, I understand the vote to leave the European Union. I understand the desire after that vote took place to redefine Brexit as including leaving the single market and the customs union as well. But Brexit was designed to free us up, to take back control, to get rid of red tape. And on the basis of what we have just been discussing, none of those things apply to food and plant products being imported from the European Union.
It's hard to argue with that. The array of... I've spent quite a bit of time in the last 10 days, and periodically as these rules have been promised and taken away again, but in the last 10 days particularly, talking to experts, and customs and trade is fearsomely complicated.
Of course.
And the answer usually to a straight question is, well, it depends. And even those who are absolutely steeped in this have to work their way through it slowly. But, you know, this is, even by the government's own figures, they say this is going to add £330 million cost to industry of finally imposing a border with Europe. I spoke to the Dutch flower industry, huge industry, basically it's the heart of flowers in Europe. It's a £9 billion industry.
I've been in one of the warehouses.
Incredible,
it's just incredible place.
$1 billion of that ends up here, and they would like it all delayed, clearly, because it's adding costs. It's not in their interest, but their spokesman told me if Brexit was about cutting down red tape, Brussels red tape, he called it, and bringing down costs, I don't see the point, because anything our industry has seen since the vote is London red tape and additional cost and bureaucracy. And it's hard to argue with that. It is the case. We've imposed our own red tape and our own costs to have control of the border, to be fair. It's what was promised.
Well, let's keep talking about borders, in particular that one that appeared down the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. I mean, we've been speaking to David Blevins outside Stormont, which may be getting back up and running soon. I mean, what does all this mean for Northern Ireland?
Okay, we thought it was complicated before.
Deep breaths, everyone.
You've spoken to David, so it'll be crystal clear in everyone's mind. The combination of a hard Brexit, by which we mean leaving the customs union and the single market, but a soft land border in Ireland, left little choice but to effectively have a border in the Irish Sea. So how do you manage that in this world? These changes are, the ones we've been talking about, will largely not apply at the western border, is what the Cabinet Office is saying. So they won't be, there's a decision, are they going to build a border control point at Ryan to handle checks, physical checks, extremely sensitive area. They haven't even made that decision. That was said to me 24 hours before this announcement in Northern Ireland. I think we realised there was a bigger picture going on. Trade across the Irish Sea between the UK and the UK, between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which are in the same country but now in separate customs unions, going to be managed by the Windsor Protocol, which effectively means anything coming GB to NI, rather in the other direction, technically is leaving the European Customs Union to enter the UK, a third country. But because that is anathema to the idea of no sea border, at the moment what the Windsor Protocol says is there will be a system of green and red lanes, reduce the paperwork, reduce the declarations. Effectively, if you, a bit like when we walk through customs, you're taking on trust. I'm nothing to declare.
Yeah.
And they're talking about sourcing the data in the easiest way possible, reducing the amount of declarations that businesses have to make. But I've just been checking with it. They are still going to be declarations that have to be made according to both the Windsor Protocol and this border model that's being introduced for the rest of the UK, or for Great Britain, from this week. So quite how you magic away declarations to the satisfaction. Remember, there's three, possibly four parties here. You've got Northern Ireland and Great Britain. The UK is a single entity. You've got the European Union, which a lot of this is about protecting its single market. So we wait and see essentially there is an attempt to smooth and finesse and make this process less obtrusive, and so that trade feels like it's free across that border. But looking at the regulations as they stand, it's not free. It is not going to be as simple as it once was.
The listeners, if you're as confused as me, don't worry. This is a really complicated and at times I'll say concerning topic. Let's finish where we started. I mean, as you say, this is just the beginning, isn't it? We've got more of this stuff to come in sector by sector basis. I mean, walk us through what else is coming down the pipe.
Well, we have we have the controls. If we set Northern Ireland to one side
course, yeah.
for the moment, we have the controls, the declarations that have to be made, the health checks I've talked about. Then from end of April, physical checks will begin. There's a whole story there around. There are shiny, brand new BCPs, as they're called, border control posts that have been built by commercial ports, many of them using public money. They've been sitting idle for years. That finally may be used. That happens at the end of April. The end of October, a couple of things supposed to happen. Sort of safety and security declarations. This is about. These are actually effectively around arms control, protected products, CITES, the controls on protected species, declarations around that kind of stuff. But there's also something promised: a world-class border. That phrase again. We're going to have the world's most advanced border with a fully digital model, which sounds fantastic. And government says they were working. Their original idea was it's all going to cost about £1 billion. They reckon they've cut half out of that. They're not yet trying to claim they've saved anyone £500 million. But the idea is you have an entirely digital model that makes it much easier for traders. Just one counterpoint to that. Back to my flower wholesaler at New Covent Garden Market. Ever since some of these controls came in for whole plants, that's anything with a root ball, so your magnolia tree or whatever it might be, you've had to declare for a while. Ever since that began, every week he posts his health certificates, posts paper copies to an address at DEFRA. And he's posted thousands of these, and he says not once has he received a single reply or acknowledgement. Now, apparently it's not that unusual trade across Europe that there are still some hard copy processes, but I am left with a vision as we move towards a world-class border of a room where the door, if you open it inside DEFRA, is full of envelopes that come flooding out. So we'll see. I mean, one feels for traders, one feels for those trying to keep business moving with these changes. One hopes that the assurances and the common sense around how it's managed is reality.
Yeah, we'll wait and see, shall we? Paul Kelso, good to see you, mate.